this picture. Raise your hand if you've seen that picture before. Okay. Seems like a lot of people. Would anybody like to tell me what that picture is?
Waddington's epigenetic landscape.
It's a good guess based on the title of the talk, I think. Yeah, so this is a picture from Waddington's 1957 book called The Strategy of Genes. It's not the first time Waddington talked about the idea of an epigenetic landscape, but this picture has probably stuck more than Waddington's actual ideas on the landscape have stuck. You see this picture reprinted in paper after paper after paper, in textbooks, all over the place, and in talks like this one. Why is this such a popular picture? Well, I think to understand that, I mean, probably if everybody's heard of it, you already know, but it's worth taking a step back and appreciating why people like the picture so much. And I think the reason has to do with the standard paradigm for understanding development. Typically, people imagine the way that one cell changes into another kind of cell as being like, sort of like a tree-like process. So you start off with a stem cell, which could become any kind of cell, and that cell decides, I'm going to become this kind of cell or that kind of cell. And then after that, it decides again, I'm going to become this kind of cell or that kind of cell, and so on until it becomes a mature, terminally differentiated cell. So the important thing in this paradigm is that I can't go backwards, and I can't switch from one branch to another branch, and I can't skip any steps. But it is biologically true that people have done experiments indicated by these arrows here. They figured out ways to go backwards and take, for example, a mature fibroblast and turn it back into a pluripotent cell. They figured out ways to go across. In this picture, you see an exocrine cell turned into a beta cell. All sorts of different directions which aren't consistent with this idea of a linear branching decision kind of tree. And you can even add a couple more. I did crudely on my own. For example, you can see you can turn a fibroblast into a cardiomyocyte, stuff like that. So you can say, okay, well, maybe the tree isn't the whole story. Maybe I need something that looks more like this. But I mean, this is probably missing the point. Just drawing a tangled web of things just looks like a mess and doesn't really help you. Instead, you can think of this epigenetic landscape idea and think instead, what if I imagined a stem cell like a ball at the top of a really tall hill, seen right here. And what happens is somehow, in the process of development, the ball gets pushed off of its initial little indent in the mountain and falls somewhere else. Maybe here, maybe there, maybe there. And each of the little pits into which it can fall represent a different cell state. And it does this over and over in development until eventually you reach a valley deep at the bottom of a mountain, which might represent a mature heart cell or mature skin cell or something else. So the interesting thing about this paradigm is that in principle, if you had sufficiently fine control of the chemicals inside of a cell, you could take the ball from any valley and push it directly into any other valley. And this is something which is not really captured well by this tree-like idea of development. So right now we have a nice metaphor. And the metaphor is helpful as a jumping off point, for example, for experiments like this one, done by Sui Wang and his colleagues. And in this experiment, you imagine if one cell type is represented by a valley over here, and another cell type is represented by a valley over here, then you can imagine more than one way to push the ball from one valley to another valley. And this is essentially what this picture says. You start here, you can go this way through state space, or you can go this way through state space. So the metaphor is helpful for informing real experiments. But still, it would be nice to make it more precise. And so the central question that I care about for the purposes of this talk is, if you give me a specific model a mathematical model of some sort of biological system, like a gene regulatory network or something, what is the height associated with each state in that model? If you give me a model, can I construct the surface associated with that model? And if you think about the metaphor, if you really think about it, I think there's two main things that such a surface should tell you. The first thing it should tell you is the size and depth of the wells should somehow reflect the relative likelihood of ending up as this kind of cell or that kind of cell. For example, does anyone here know how many more skin cells there are than like heart cells? Like an order of magnitude? Dr. Wishwood, do you know? Well, I don't know. Suppose it's like there's 300 times more skin cells than heart cells. It's probably not the real number. Then you'd expect somehow the well corresponding to skin cells would be like 300 times bigger or deeper or something than the well corresponding to heart cells. So the first piece of information is it should tell you something about the relative occupancy of the states of your system. And the second piece of information, and this is the most important one, especially for the talk, is that if you look at the curves of the landscape, that should tell you which way a cell will move to get from one state to another state. So let me tell you something about the landscape models that people have published. Beforehand, I should say that we have to restrict ourselves to certain kinds of biological models. In particular, if you're trying to model the interactions between genes and mRNA and proteins or whatever, you have to let your model have some sort of stochastic component, because otherwise there's not really a notion of jumping between different attractors. And a purely deterministic system, once I fall into an attractor, I stay there forever. And that's not consistent with real biology. So the models that we're going to think about, they have some sort of randomness to them. And you need, in addition, some sort of notion of transition probabilities, the probability that I get from this state to this other state in some amount of time, and steady state probabilities. If I wait a really long time, what's the probability I end up here instead of there? And examples of models that people think about, mostly in this literature, people think about SDE, stochastic differential equation models, which is where you take an ordinary differential equation and then you tack on some random fluctuations. But then there's other models too, chemical master equation stuff, Boolean networks, Markov models, all sorts of things. I should say, in principle, you should be able to define a landscape for any kind of model here, or any other kind of model that satisfies the requirements I talked about. Okay, so normally when people talk about the landscape without qualification, they talk about this thing, Jin Wang's steady state probability landscape. And it's defined very simply in terms of the steady state probability distribution of a system. It's just minus the log of it. And given that almost any model you can write down has some notion of a steady state probability, this isn't restricted to certain kinds of models, which is nice. So of the two requirements that we talked about, it captures the first one and it doesn't capture the second one, because steady state probabilities don't really tell you about transitions pretty much by definition. That's a nice picture of it. And even the picture tells you, if you look at these arrows, that the most likely way on the landscape to get from here to here, this yellow one, is not the same as the most likely way to get from here to here. So somehow the ball isn't just moving according to the contours of the landscape. There's another one. This one is called the normal decomposition or vector decomposition landscape. This one is much less important than the other one. So I'm going to kind of, this one and some other ones just blaze through. Essentially, all you need to know about this one is that it can be viewed as a certain approximation of the previous one, valid for certain types of SDE models. And it captures, once again, the first one, our first requirement about relative occupancy, and not the second one. This one is a little bit more interesting. Friedland and Wenzel are mathematicians, and they are known for studying something called large deviation theory. It's a mathematical theory that tells you something about rare events. For example, you might want to study if you're interested in avoiding a stock market crash or something. So they have this complicated looking definition of the quasi-potential here. But the content of this is essentially, given a fixed point x0, if I'm more likely to end up traveling from x0 to this state than I am to travel to this other state, then the landscape should be deeper here than it is over there. And I appreciate the pantomiming. I don't know if that's helpful, but I'm still going to try. So this is somehow a local notion of a landscape. It depends on which point you're talking about. So it satisfies, in some sense, our second requirement, although it doesn't tell you paths. It just tells you something about the probability of transitions. It's only defined for SDE models and essentially captures the same content as the transition probability. And in fact, you can take this definition and tweak it ever so slightly and make it reflect pretty much exactly the transition probability. It's just minus the log of that. This isn't what they wrote down, but I think this is a reasonable extrapolation of their ideas, especially given the rest of what I'm going to talk about. Let me talk about two more. I'm not going to be exhausting all the landscapes people have written down. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of it. This one is a landscape published by Bhattacharya and his colleagues. It's bad. That's why I have trash. Because it only applies to ODE models. It doesn't account for stochasticity. And like I said, I think noise is an important thing to think about. Qualitatively, having noise is different than not having noise. So this is not even really relevant for us. There's another one, which is also trash, for basically the same reason. The definition is kind of complicated, so I'm not going to dwell on it, although if anybody's curious, I can try to explain. This is only defined for SDE models in more than one dimension, and it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't satisfy either of our requirements, and in fact disagrees with things like the steady state probability. For people that are knowledgeable in dynamical systems, it turns out what this guy has constructed is somehow equivalent to like a Lyapunov function. But if you're interested really in probabilities, this isn't helpful. So okay, so we've gone through the lineup, and you may have noticed that none of them have satisfied both of our requirements, which is a problem, you know? I mean, it'd be nice if we could find one that did. So we have these two requirements, relative occupancy information and transition path information. And, you know, we face a basic question. Can we find a landscape that satisfies the first requirement, for example? And the answer is, yes, we can, and it's not that hard. For example, the Jin-Wang steady state probability landscape trivially satisfies that requirement. And this is the reason that people use it, essentially.
So when people talk about transitions using this framework, are they just stopping before a steady state has been reached to try and understand paths? Or
I'm going to try and answer this fast. But if you look back at this picture, for example, you see these transitions. So these aren't just like for the picture. These were calculated, and these were calculated in a completely different way. So generally speaking, if you talk about transitions on that landscape, you just do the landscape and then calculate transitions some other way, and maybe put them on top of each other.
okay,
So yeah.
so basically using stochastic simulation to estimate how often something moves to another place.
That's one way you could do it. I'll say more about that.
Go on. Yeah. I'm just wondering, does your definition of a good model changes for closed system, where nothing leaves the system, versus an open one, where there's a production of cells and then a removal of cells?
It doesn't matter. As long as you have some notion of probability, then it doesn't matter.
So is your main concern that these theories do not really capture actually the shape of the landscape, but basically just the relative height to each other and maybe the maximum of the intermediate state, and then assume a certain shape of this transition?
So my main concern is what I'm going to say next, and that's you can quantify what the most likely transition path between two states looks like, and you can show that there's no way to get a landscape that the contours of that somehow reflect that path.
So do you know Kramer theory?
What's that?
Kramer theory, so that's actually a theory which is based on
Yeah,
the
Kramer.
Master equation, for which you can actually infer back what the landscape would look like for a potential energy landscape. So you can not only get the relative height of the wells and where the the quasi-steady state is, but you can actually also estimate how do you actually get there.
So
You have a very steep slope on one side, a very shallow slope on the other side, which gives you different transition rates.
So my understanding is that Kramer's theory, which I've seen in the context of Brownian motion and stuff, it still doesn't tell you quite the same information. And let me go on and be more specific about it. So yeah, so the question is, can we satisfy the second requirement? Can we construct a landscape so that the contours somehow tell you something about transition paths? And the answer is more complicated because the math related to transition paths is a little bit more complicated. So let me speak briefly on that. Here's a beautiful drawing, courtesy of me. If you imagine, for the moment, a continuous stochastic system, just because that's easier to visualize, and you think about all the ways I could go from point A to point B, you could take all sorts of crazy looking paths. So here, you could go this way, you could go that way, you could go a straightest looking path, whatever. But generally speaking, except in certain artificial, highly symmetric situations, there's always going to be some path which is more likely that the cell takes than any other path, highlighted in blue here. And that's what you call the most probable or most likely or least action path. It's the answer to the very specific question, what is the probability that I go from point A to point B in a fixed amount of time t? And that time requirement turns out to be important. Now, how do you quantify which paths are likely and which paths are not likely? One way is through this function called the action. The notation is usually S because it comes from physics. And what it does is you put in a path and it spits out a number. And paths which are more likely, S has a lower number. And paths which are less likely, S has a higher number. So for example, the true path or whatever for this system, I said maybe it's 0.1. And these crazy paths, that could be 100 or 200 or something else. So okay, what is S then? Turns out if you do some legwork, for example, for a one-dimensional stochastic differential equation model, S turns out to be this functional in terms of the deterministic part of the dynamics and the thing that controls the fluctuations, F and G. And you can generalize this to more than one dimension. The notation gets a little bit more crowded, but essentially you still have x dot minus f squared in some way multiplied by this thing which is called the diffusion tensor. The exact form of this is not that important, which is why I'm kind of going fast. But just know that you can write these things down.
And the capital T here is time.
Yes, so you're thinking about all paths from point A to point B which take time t. So where does this come from? Well, it turns out this comes from path integrals. So is anybody here physics or like physics adjacent? I know you got a degree in physics. Okay. So people are generally familiar with path integrals from quantum mechanics, where you can use them to formulate a completely independent notion of amplitudes and whatever. But it turns out you can formulate stochastic dynamics in just the same language. And in particular, write a transition probability between point A and point B in some amount of time as an integral over all the possible ways you could go from point A to point B in that time. And I'm sure you're very curious, how'd you drive something like this? Well, let me tell you, it's very interesting. If you want to ask me about it, I'll be more than happy to answer, but it's a little bit afield from what we're doing now. So I'm going to move on from that. Okay, so you have the action, and it looks like whatever it looks like. So what can you do? How do you find the most probable path given the action? Well, one thing you can do, which is probably the state-of-the-art way, is you could guess. You could just try this path and try that path and try a bunch of other paths and you calculate the action each time, and then eventually you find one which has a lower one than the rest of them, and you say that's probably the most likely one or close enough to it. Like I said, state of the art. The other way you could do it is you could follow the prescription of the calculus of variations or classical mechanics, and you could write down some Euler-Lagrange equations, get some second-order ODEs from that, and try to solve those. In practice, numerically, those are less stable, but for simple things that you can solve with pen and paper, they're very helpful. Yeah, so
as you scale these, the higher dimensions, where's the sticking point? Because you're integrating over time, so it's not like you have high-order integral problems where you're integrating over large spaces.
right. So what's interesting about this, as opposed to some sort of Monte Carlo method or something, is that if you come up with some sort of algorithm to try possible paths, it actually scales linearly with dimension, which is kind of nice.
So if I wanted to embed my surface in a hypercube, say, I'm not going to have to spend...
No, it doesn't go up, to the D or whatever. Anyway, so details aren't that important for our purposes. The important thing is that you can do this. If you give me a model and ask what's the fastest or most likely way to get from point A to point B in time t, I can give you an answer. And it doesn't have to take that long. You can run some of these things in a couple seconds. So what do we learn? Well, qualitatively, one interesting feature that pops up again and again when you start looking at these things is that the most likely way to get from point A to point B, for example, in this bimodal model of two genes interacting with each other, the most likely way to get from point A to point B is not the same as the most likely way to get from point B to point A. And if you think that the dynamics of the cell are just due to some surface, this should give you pause, because in classical mechanics, this would not be true, at least for a momentum-independent potential. The other thing is that if you ask the question, what's the most likely way to get from point A to point B in 1 second versus what's the most likely way to get from point A to point B in 10 seconds or an hour or something, the answers can be qualitatively different, which is kind of interesting. So for example, if I go from here to here, depending on the amount of time I say it will take, the most likely path can curve to the left somehow. And again, this is interesting and not really consistent intuitively, I think, with the idea of going according to the contours of a landscape.
Real quick, tell me that. So are you saying that it has to take exactly 10 seconds to get there? Or are you saying that within 10 seconds, what is the most likely?
It's a good question. So obviously, suppose you were to simulate the system, you would almost never find that it takes exactly 10 seconds. Maybe you could get it so it does like 10 plus or minus 1 second or something. So really, if you want to refine it, you'd say, if I have a cell and it starts here and it ends there within 10 plus or minus epsilon seconds or whatever, the path is going to be somehow close to the path that I have here. That's, I guess, the way I might think about it.
But basically, if you...
Sorry. Yeah. No. I mean, it's fine. Just go.
So, I mean, if you basically go along this trajectory and you plot your energy landscape for this, your potentials, they look very different probably, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what's the point then here? Do you say that if you use different durations of time, you can actually use that to map out your landscape?
No, what I'm saying here is that if you imagined that there was one path that was the best way to get from point A to point B based on the surface of the landscape, you'd expect trajectories going according to different times to be like a faster or slower version of that same path. But here it's just a completely different path. So, I mean, this isn't any rigorous thing, but it's informative for what comes later, which is more so. Sorry, Nikita, do you have a question?
My question was because, like in biology, time can fluctuate, right, depending on temperature, cell division rates, metabolic rates, of course. Well, let's say the time can fluctuate from 1 to 10, and then the biological system would have to be robust to produce the exact number of cells within this range. So the most probable path would be the one which produces the same number of cells over a range of times, right? Rather than an exactly time.
I'm not sure I understand.
So my thinking is like, let's say there is only one path you can use. And then with this path you have to get from A to B either in 1 second or in 10 seconds, right? And like some paths will be faster, like more efficient at 1 second, another path at 5, another path at 10. But certain paths will be decently efficient over a range of time.
Well, let me stop you, I guess, and say this has no judgment regarding the efficiency of these paths. It's just if you ask what did the system most likely do, that's the answer. Yeah. Is that related to efficiency?
Yeah, it's
Probably. Possibly. Brooks, do you have a question? No? Okay. Anyway. Let's get into the meat of what I had to talk about today with this provocatively named section. So let me state again, we have these two requirements that we'd like our mathematical surface to satisfy in some way. The relative occupancy requirement and the transition paths requirement. So given that we know more about the math behind transition paths, there's a couple ways you could implement that requirement that at least I've come up with that I think seem to be reasonable. And then there's this other thing which should be mentioned for completeness' sake. So I'm going to go through each of these one by one, and given the section title, you could probably guess that it's not going to work. So, the journey more important than the destination right now, I would say. Okay, so the first thing, trying to model the kind of thing you see in equilibrium statistical mechanics, the kind of thing captured by the Jin-Wang landscape. Can you have a landscape which somehow satisfies this property that the ratio of steady state probabilities of two states is like the exponential of the difference between the landscape values at those states? Like I said, we're trying to mimic physics here. Can we construct some sort of function in general that does this? And the answer is yes, we can. We already did, so we can probably just move on. It's just the one that I talked about before, the Jin-Wang PSS landscape. Okay, fine, that's not that interesting. Let's move on to something more interesting. In equilibrium stochastic systems, for example, protein folding, people like to imagine an energy landscape that somehow tells you about the conformations that a protein is more or less likely to occupy. And so in this picture of what's going on, if I imagine starting at one point on the energy landscape and I wait one time step, I'm most likely to go down the direction of the gradient. I could go somewhere else, but this is the direction I'm most likely to go. And again, if I'm here, I'm most likely to go down the direction of the gradient. Here, most likely to go down the direction of the gradient until eventually probably I hit some sort of stable conformation or something. So the intuition is one time step in the future, I want my system to go down the gradient of some surface. Can you construct a surface that does that? In order to make this precise, you could do it a couple ways. I chose to do it using the action. You can discretize the action and use it to imagine what happens one time step in the future. This is kind of technical baggage. You don't need to worry too much about it. But the point is that if I say I want to construct a landscape where the next thing that the system does is it most likely goes down the gradient of this surface, in general, I can't do that because in general, the deterministic dynamics of your system don't satisfy this conservative requirement. One key difference from equilibrium statistical mechanics, or the kind of things you see in protein folding, to what you see in biology. This requirement here is not true. So you can show that this doesn't work in general. Okay, fine, we need some other notion of satisfying the transition path requirement. Okay, what about, in general relativity? People have these cool pictures of there's like a ball on like a rubber sheet, and the motion of a planet as it goes around according to the contours of the rubber sheet. Mathematically, it has to do with differential geometry. And you ask, you can essentially ask the question, can I come up with some Riemannian manifolds for which the motion of the cell corresponds to a geodesic? And the answer is no, you can't in general. In fact, almost always. But as a simple example, here's a simple example. And really the problem has to do with the fact that this is the Lagrangian you might write down for a ball, a geodesic on a certain surface. This is our Lagrangian, and it turns out this has more possible behaviors than this does. So that one doesn't work. We have to move on to something else. Oh yeah, and so another way to think about it is the equations of motion that you get from the geodesic look kind of like this. It looks like x double dot plus x double dot squared times some other things. And our Lagrangian gives something extra in addition to that in general. This isn't a proof, but it's some intuition. Okay, so another thing you could do is you could say, okay, well, people like to talk about the landscape using the word quasi-potential. They imagine that it offers some notion of a potential even when our system doesn't come endowed with an actual physical potential. So can I imagine that for some system, our landscape is literally the potential? Can I literally think of this as a potential in the sense of classical mechanics? And the answer is, if you define this and you say you want the solution to this Lagrangian to be the same as the one we know is correct, you can't do it in general. And again, there's many examples. Similar to the last one, it has to do with the fact that our Lagrangian can have more possible behaviors than this one allows for. So that doesn't work. So we need something else. Okay? We can get really bold and we can say, if Waddington imagined the dynamics of the cell as being like a ball rolling around on some landscape, can I take that completely literally? Can I come up with some surface for which, it's like you have the geodesic motion coupled to some sort of force of gravity, and can I get those solutions to match what we know to be correct? Here's Lagrangian if you wanted to write it down. You have the normal free motion thing, and then you have this gravity term. And in this one, you need to go to at least 2 dimensions to find a counterexample, but it's very easy to find one. And once again, in general, you can't construct one that has this work. So you say, well,
John, can I ask you a question?
sure.
You said like you're doing this based on what's already known. So are you like comparing it to existing data? Do you have like an accuracy score? How are you comparing it to what are you getting?
It's a good question. So this is purely mathematical. No data, no experiments, no anything. I'm just asking. Let me go back to this slide. You can show that if you have certain mathematical models, which people do use to describe real experiments, given that in those models you can do some math and find that this thing tells you the most likely way to get from any point A to any point B, does this math thing match these other math things that I'm coming up with? And so it's a separate thing to whether your model agrees with data, but it's like, can your model even do this thing? So yeah.
So are you trying to say that you have a model and there are certain assumptions that go into that, and you try to see if these assumptions are fulfilled by any of these different descriptions?
Right, so I'm kind of looking at, for this, what people tend to look at in the landscape literature, which is a general SDE model. So making no assumptions about noise or the function f or anything else. Because people do consider those kinds of models in general. They're not restricted to certain requirements or functional forms or whatever. So if you take that general view, I have some SDE model, can it do this? The answer turns out to be no. Okay, so yeah, this other thing also doesn't work. it doesn't capture the same range of behavior that we need, even though it turns out this ball on the hill landscape does a little bit better than the other ones we talked about.
So if you add like a random component to this, would it be closer to what you would expect? I don't know what you would expect, but would it be closer? Because it seems like the only thing that's missing from any of these is like the random stochasticity or whatever.
So what do you mean by random term?
Like just a term that would like introduce randomness to the system.
So these are already random systems. These are SDEs. So it's like
Okay.
you have the OD plus the times. I'm sorry if I wasn't specific.
I thought these were different from the SDs that you were talking about.
No. So we're trying to see if, given what we know about transitions in an SDE system, if we can come up with some landscape which reflects what we know about that.
A static landscape.
Yeah, yeah. So one height to each state and nothing else. It's a little bit confusing, but free to ask more. So I'm sure I'm not, be doing better. Anyway, okay, so interesting side note, the ball on the hill landscape doesn't work. But if you make one additional modification, you can get something to work. It turns out that the dynamics of a cell exploring state space under some noisy dynamics or whatever can be mapped exactly to a charged particle on a Riemannian manifolds subject to some electromagnetic field. And actually, this is an observation, I was not the first one to make it, it's been made before. In the papers of Jin Wang, this kind of idea is featured kind of prominently. His idea was that I know that the landscape doesn't seem to give me what I want, but maybe if I add a little vector field everywhere, that sort of accounts for the rest of the dynamics, then maybe I can think of things that way. So it's sort of like if I have my ball here and the landscape tells me I go this way, I also factor in the fact that I have this other thing which tells me to go that way, and I take into account both of those arrows and go somewhere. Unfortunately, this is not really in the spirit of Waddington's metaphor. What you'd really like is you'd like to just have a landscape and not some other thing on top of that, and have that tell you what's going to happen. I tend to think that this is cheating, because it's kind of like, my system is it goes according to the landscape, except for all the parts that don't.
So, what if Waddington's landscape is just an illustration?
Well, that's basically the point of what I'm saying. Yeah, I think it is for the most part. Anyway, let me go on. So we have the following possibilities left. So basically nothing that we've come up with has worked, which is good, I guess, or bad, I don't know. The question is, now what can we do? We could just give up and say, it looks like the landscape just isn't a good idea, and we shouldn't try to worry about making it quantitative. But I think that would be a little bit premature. Because, the things that the pictures that people generate in papers, for example, this picture from a Jin Wang paper, there's still helpful visualizations of what's going on. And maybe they don't tell you the full story. They don't tell you what transitions look like. But they do tell you something, and that something is still helpful. We just need to be more realistic about what we want this thing to tell us, if not everything. So we can do some math and take a step back and think about what we want. What do we want? What should a landscape tell us? Would anybody like to volunteer an answer to this question? What do you want?
It should match the data.
That's a good answer. Okay. Do I have any other answers? Anybody like to be brave?
Relative occupancy.
Okay.
Transition paths.
Something
Okay. Well,
Something to guide a new experiment.
Okay, that's good.
So if you know the landscape, if you could really measure this, or you could know that, then you could probably say, okay, I want to go this path, and this would then tell you what kind of factors you need to, for example, reprogram a cell, Or you could maybe even think about if you make a mutation in this protein there, then this bump goes up and then the cells go another way. So you could, I mean, experimentally, if this is really like what's going on, but I mean right now, I think it's trial and error and a lot of expertise and knowledge. And so the question is, can you ever get there?
I completely agree.
I mean, this is like a three-dimensional representation of the landscapes, but it can be higher dimensional.
Yeah, so just to be clear, for the purposes of what I was talking about before, I assumed the landscape was some general number of dimensions. Obviously the pictures are 3D, but yeah. But yeah, guide experiments, you look at the landscape and you change it somehow and you see, okay, well I should probably do this thing to make the cell go that way.
Because basically it has to be consistent with the detailed dynamical data that does not yet exist, but various people, myself included, are trying to get. And two, once you have that, you should make a verifiable prediction which says, without any prior knowledge, where I am now, I can get you to a different point, and then we'll see if you can get there.
It's good.
I think it should simplify the inputs, simplify the description of the model so that the input field becomes less complicated. Because you could always just get rid of the landscape, just make your electromagnetic field complicated enough to describe whatever are different inputs that you put into the system. Somehow the landscape should lead to a simpler model that includes possible forcing terms on the system.
It's a good thought. Let me just spoil it and give you my answer. What should a landscape tell us? I think it should tell us something that isn't wrong. Maybe that's a little bit anticlimactic, but let me try to explain. In particular, qualitative information about our system, which is true, is okay. So let me show you a definition, a naive definition, which I think says something about this idea. Tell me something that isn't wrong about our system. So the definition says, if, I'm thinking about steady state probabilities, if this state is at least as likely as this state, then the landscape should be here, at least as low as it is over here. Might be kind of hard to parse. Let me show you some examples. Here is an example of a self-regulating gene model, which I came up with. And you can calculate exactly the steady state probability distribution. You can take minus the log and think about the Jin-Wang landscape, and it looks like this. You have a pit over here, and then you have a pit over there. This satisfies the definition that I just showed you. But three other things that satisfy the definition, as you can see in my beautiful artistic renditions. You can imagine taking that landscape and stretching it, making it bigger or smaller. And while you lose quantitative information about which states are more likely than which other states, you still preserve the qualitative. I still know that here is more likely than there, and here is more likely than there, for example. If you translate this function, move it up or down however you like, that also satisfies this definition. You don't lose any information really at all if you do that. And another thing you can imagine doing is you can imagine completely flattening everything. And you might say, well, what's the point of thinking about something like that? That doesn't tell you anything whatsoever. And you'd be right if you said that. But it also doesn't tell you anything that's wrong. You're like, totally, it could be whatever. So that's sort of like the trivial example of landscape. So yeah, here's all those three examples, just pictured.
One of those landscapes. I have a hypothetical.
Okay.
Suppose that either this picture or the next. Suppose that a cell had memory of where it had been. how would you modify your landscape? Because right now it appears to me that you are kind of doing the quasi-static approximation, basically saying the cell's state is determined by the local energy environment. But what if, in fact, the cell had memory?
Okay, so I have a very easy way to weasel out of what you just said. And that's, I'm talking about, in this definition, any state of the system, and if you need more data to specify the state, for example, like a position and a velocity or something, then that's fine. That's your state.
Okay, but before you, what I'm trying to understand the extent to which you were trying to fit your model to the mathematics versus the mathematics to the biology. And so a fundamental question, I think a model would look quite different if the differentiating cells contained a memory of prior history, either through epigenetics or some other factors. And then there's a question, if you start looking at condensed matter physics in complex systems, you get anomalous diffusion where you have basically supranormal and subnormal diffusion, and you can get nonlinear rheology, and I can imagine an anisotropic fixiotropy, which means that the viscosity depends upon both velocity and direction. And so what I'm trying to figure out is how do you design experiments to determine whether the cells exhibit anomalous diffusion in n-dimensional genetic phase space or anisotropic fixiotropy in high-dimensional genetic phase space, or have memory, which the other two basically could include memory.
I mean, all I can say is I don't know how you do that, but I know that this formalism allows for any kind of system, even with memory, even with anomalous diffusion, even with whatever, as long as there is some notion of probability.
Good.
That's my claim.
Okay.
Okay, so I talked about these examples, and here's them pictured on top of each other. So same thing.
Actually, kind of a bit of a thing to address that. So if there was maybe hysteresis or something like that, then that could possibly address the memory thing. But I don't know. Yeah.
So
But you're saying you could fold hysteresis into your state description.
right.
In other words, it's a neat trick to get out of it.
Right. Well, thanks, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, let's move on. So the thing that I just told you about is what I would call a global landscape because it reflects steady state probabilities. It tells you something about those. But you can imagine a very similar definition which talks about transition probabilities. If I pick a fixed point x0 and I consider the probability that I go here, if I find that it's bigger than the probability of going there, then I want my landscape to be lower here than it is over there. So this construction would depend in general upon the initial point that you choose along with the time scale that you care about. And it turns out that the Friedland-Wenzel local quasi-potential satisfies this definition. You can imagine a very similar definition, instead thinking about transition probabilities to a common point. If I'm more likely to have been here than I was to have been here, the landscape should be lower here than it is there. That's what this says. These are all variations on a common theme.
So why do you say that the landscape has to be lower there? I don't get that.
So if you think about, for example, imagine a steady state probability distribution with one peak and another peak or something like that. When people think about the landscape, they imagine regions of high probability to correspond to low valleys.
Yeah, but if you have a landscape, the actual probability that you end up in a well is not necessarily the depth of the well.
No, it's not necessarily the depth of the well. So
Would it be accurate to say that you're looking for something that generally preserves order?
Yeah, order preserving is correct. So yeah, obviously, the probability of going into this region is not just the height. It's like the integral of all this probability here. I mean, I'm accounting for that, and I'll say more about that in a second. Anyway, yeah. So those are my definitions of global. Okay. Those are my definitions of local and global landscapes. Here's a quick aside on why it's worth thinking about local landscapes and not just global landscapes. Imagine a system which is determined by this potential. Imagine starting a bunch of cells here and watching as they jump from here to here, to here, to here, and eventually to here. It takes time to go all the way to the rightmost attractor. In fact, it may take more time than your experimental timescale. If I were to look at the local landscape just after I put the cells in, you just see them in one place. If I waited one order of magnitude later, you'd see them in the second place. If I waited even later, you'd see them in the third place. Depending on the timescale I care about, different landscapes would tell me what I'm interested in knowing. And this potential wouldn't be as helpful because maybe I'm not going to wait long enough for anything to get over here.
So what dynamical measurements would help you determine the shape of the landscape? Now, right now you've been focusing on relative populations. But are there dynamic measurements that would inform you? They're effectively velocities. You haven't been talking about measuring velocities. You're talking about measuring steady-state populations.
I also talked about transition probabilities. That was the idea behind the local landscape.
Would you equate a transition probability with a velocity? That seems fair.
Yeah, that's related. It's a related
Okay, so
idea.
the question is, which is more important to measure the probabilities, the velocities, or the concentrations?
It depends. It depends on the time scale of your experiment. If you're waiting a really long time and you know that some intermediate states aren't important or something, then steady state is probably good enough. If you're interested in something where there's a lot of dynamical switching between different attractors, then in that case you can want something that captures transition probabilities, I would think. Anyway, running low on time, so let me go past this last section here. Let me just say that the definitions that I gave you, which I put the naive tag next to, they could be better. And they could be better for two reasons that I could think of. One is that, as you pointed out in the back, coarse grain descriptions are very common. We don't normally talk about the probability that I get to the deepest part of the well or something. We talk about the probability to get to the well at all, which is a group of states. And another thing we could think about is sometimes you can collect and compile information in such a way that you can't compare all the information you get. And let me show you two pictures to kind of illustrate these ideas. For example, this idea of coarse graining. If you imagine an ideal system where the steady state probability or some probability or something is like 2 peaks, if you imagine it as a continuous thing, you have a height associated with each real number, let's say. But if you do a real experiment, probably one, this is probably way better than what people generally actually do because these measurements are hard. If you do a real experiment, you tend to bin things. I don't think about the probability that I get this state. I think of the probability that I get this range of states or this group of states. And even, a simple experiment closer to what people actually do, because this is very hard, you could just count, I got this many cells that became kind of over here and this many cells that got kind of over there. And these should all be valid descriptions of your system. And the definition should somehow reflect that. Another thing is that sometimes maybe you have information that you can't compare, but which still tells you something. For example, if I did one experiment in one region of phase space, and I found that these states over here are more likely than this sort of empty desert, and then I did a separate experiment, and I found that these states over there are more likely than this region over here, I can imagine combining that information into one little graph And even though, since these are completely separate experiments and I have no way to compare them, this still tells me some useful information. It still tells me cells are most likely to be over here or over there, even though I don't know which one is more likely. This is going along with the idea of the landscape as really being something which quantifies your ignorance about a system. It should tell you something which is true, or at least not wrong. So the solutions to those two problems, first of all, in general, work with groups of states which are disjoint instead of individual states, although you can work with individual states if you like. And then also admit up front that not all of the states in your model are maybe comparable. So I'm going to show you some general definitions. I'll kind of flash by because I guess I'm running low on time. But as a side note, I'll be using some measure theoretic notation. If you're not familiar with it, don't get scared. It says almost the same thing as before. So here's a modified version of the definition I showed you earlier of a global landscape. And the only difference is now, instead of working with individual states in the state space, I'm working with some partition of the state space. And I'm thinking about whether this group of states is at least as likely as this other group of states. And I'm allowing myself to say not all of these are comparable. And you can modify the other definitions in just the same way. You don't have to worry about it. You get the idea. And let me just end by saying the following. In math, when people define some kind of object, it's often nice and informative to think about what it means to have a map between those two different objects. For example, groups or rings or whatever you like. And if we think about what landscapes are and how we see them in practice, quantifying our ignorance about some sort of stochastic system, there is some intuitive notion of a map between landscapes. For example, I can imagine a two-state system corresponding to a coarse-grained version of this bimodal continuous system. I could map this state on the left to this group of states on the left, and this state on the right to this group of states on the right, or vice versa. One of these maps would correspond to a gain in information, for example, by doing experiments. One of these maps would correspond to a loss of information by doing some sort of approximation. It turns out that you can formalize this notion in the definition of a landscape map, which is essentially an order-preserving map. And if you write down this definition, it has the nice property that if you compose a landscape map, F, with one of the landscapes, it turns into a landscape in the other system. It turns a landscape over here into a landscape over there. Couple last comments before I conclude. They have some nice other properties, which I'm just mentioning here for completeness' sake. You can compose them. There's an identity map. If you take landscapes plus landscape maps, you get a small category. They can formalize some other things. And then lastly, normally when people think about categorifying probability spaces or measure spaces, they talk about measure preserving maps. This is a notion which is a little bit more general. Okay, and finally, the takeaway that I like to leave you with is that even though we can't come up with a landscape that does all the things that we want, we can still come up with some useful notions of what a landscape can be that tell us something about our system that isn't wrong, that could help us in some way. It's still useful as a way of quantifying what we know and what we don't know, even if it doesn't tell us everything. And with that, thanks for listening. I'm done.
So do you think if you relaxed the constraint on finding a static landscape and you allowed it to be Waddington's movie, would you be able to simultaneously see occupancy and transitions?
What do you mean Waddington's movie?
Like the landscape is allowed to evolve in time such that it's, and this isn't like necessarily a crazy idea because like if you have a chemical mastery equation and things are being produced, in theory that's a new landscape because there's new things in the system. And so you could, if you allowed your landscape to evolve in time, could you find landscape, or like a landscape movie, essentially, that would satisfy both your requirement of transitional paths and your requirement of steady-state probabilities?
So first of all, I will have to say I respectfully disagree philosophically about this point that if something's created or destroyed, that changes your landscape. Sui Wong made a big point about this in some of his papers, that the system that you have and the network architecture and whatever is fixed from the beginning. The network doesn't change, the landscape doesn't change, unless you're ignoring part of your system. Like maybe you have a parameter that tweaks the landscape, but really if you were to include another chemical species, then the landscape would be static, something like that. So I don't think that the landscape changes over time with things being created or destroyed. But could a movie be okay? First, I would just say, I think again, it's a little bit cheating. Like, we couldn't get it to work the way we wanted it, so we're gonna just find something else that does it. And at that point, you're like, just give up and do something else.
No, it's not cheating, it's just a different interpretation.
Well, I have a different interpretation of that. But do I think it could be done? I think probably you'd run into some other problem. Because fundamentally, it just seems like the idea of trying to capture this with any kind of surface just doesn't work. Unless you have something extra which just accounts for everything else, which really is cheating.
If it's somehow equivalent to the field. You said it works if you have an external field. Is that like somehow equivalent to having a movie? So you don't have a field, but you have a movie, or you have a field but no movie. And
I don't think so, because the field would be static and the landscape would be static. I think, yeah, I'm gonna just say I don't think it'll work. We talk more about it, I guess.
Also, did you consider using any other sort of stochastic simulations besides those equations you use there? Because when you add noise, there's certain solutions that you can't actually, my certain understanding, you can't actually get, assuming that sort of framework. So I was wondering.
So, can you elaborate a little bit?
Yes, I guess what I mean is, say, like, I imagine that if you're adding noise, my thought about, I guess my interpretation is that you're adding back noise in the match you do, that essentially, I guess you're sort of adding noise to the deterministic solution of what your original equation is. So I was wondering if you thought about using any sort of other more probabilistic frameworks like chemical master equation or any other sort of like modeling the probability, I guess.
So good point to bring up. And I think the point can be thought about in this, oh, I forgot, I haven't been rephrasing questions. Oh, the point can be thought of like this. Some people, what they do is they write down a deterministic equation and they tack on noise as this extra thing. The proper thing to do, in some sense, is to look at a list of chemical reactions and write down a corresponding chemical master equation and think about that. I should say that much of what I talked about is for any kind of system with a probability distribution, so like the stuff at the end especially, applies to chemical master equation things and SDE things and all sorts of other things. The proof section had specifically to do with SDE type models where it turns out that there's a canonical way to convert a CME model to an SDE model that still accounts for a lot of the crazy noise stuff. It's not just like tacking on noise to a deterministic thing. So even if you do that, the best continuous representation of the CME that you can, you still can't get this thing to work. That's what I'd say.
Anything else?
I guess this is one quick question, more of a comment. I think it's kind of interesting. Like a bit of an analogy, instead of like a dry landscape, what if it was like an ocean where there's like currents? So like maybe that might I know that kind of ties in with like the CLC we were talking about.
Right.
I just think it's like kind of a cool analogy that like maybe if you're like explaining to other people, also that might be a cool thing to bring up.
So yeah, I mean, you could, once again, you think of a landscape plus some extra structure, like magnetic fields or like currents or something that explain the rest of the dynamics. I tend not to prefer that for aesthetic reasons, but maybe you could do something like that. But again, that sort of goes against the original spirit of the metaphor, I would say.
I got one. Forgive me if this is just.
Probably not.
Okay, so really good talk. I really like the provocative title, like that the landscape doesn't exist. So let me ask you this though, and maybe it was embedded in there, I didn't quite get it. I get the idea that the landscape is a metaphor, it helps, it's just an idea, right? And I also, it makes sense to me that finding a mathematical framework that defines everything that we imagine this metaphor to be is hard. But then it seems to me that there's two possibilities. Either it's literally impossible, or we just haven't found the right framework yet. You seem to be saying it's like mathematically impossible to find a framework.
So let me, for once, be slightly more careful about what I'm saying here. I understand the title and so on. So we started off with a metaphor, and embedded in that metaphor, at least as I interpreted it, there were two requirements about what it should tell you. These requirements were soft. They weren't mathematically specific. So I don't even think it's answerable if it's mathematically possible or not. What I was really trying to answer, and what I think one really should be trying to answer, is given as many reasonable interpretations of this that you can come up with, can you find something that works? And I have found the answer in all cases to be no. And I've also found that the only time you can find something that works is if you add something else on top of the landscape, which defeats the point. So in short, is it mathematically impossible? I don't even think that's a well-defined question. Is it impossible mathematically in most ways that you can imagine it being concretely stated? I think the answer is yes.
I mean, you are an existence proof that there is a solution to the 10 to the 20th dimensional problem of directed evolution of a stochastic system. Okay, so now the question is, what is the mathematics that describes that? So I think the bottom line is I have great faith in biology because it usually works reasonably well. And so that's why I don't think that the problem is that a mathematical model doesn't exist. One that does exist can be solved with an analog computer. You are a 10 to the 20th dimensional analog computer. And so the question is what is the most compact representation in a digital sense or in a mathematical sense to do a dimensionality reduction from 10 to the 20th dimensions to 4?
Well, let me just say, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But at least in this talk and the way that I think about landscapes, I don't think about them as three-dimensional. I think about them as existing in some arbitrary number of dimensions according to the number of dimensions of your system. So even there, it can't work. So I think it wouldn't be able to work in 3 dimensions either. And
well, you're drawing, but it is working or not. 3 dimensions is, your plots are 3-dimensional. So that's when I say reduce it to 3 dimensions, is can you reduce it to the point where you can draw it on a blackboard? So that's what I mean by dimensionality reduction. And you are a 10 to the 20th dimensional object.
So I mean, I don't know. I think the problem with dimensionality reduction is just a separate problem.
Eric, so this sounds like a good place to cut it off and chat up front.